DevilNeverCry.
Welcome to the next installment in a series of guides for Final Fantasy XVI. In today's video, I'll be taking you through Ultramaniac mode and giving you my top tips to help you survive, though most of the tips I talk about here can be applied to Final Fantasy mode as well. If you're interested in more guides and content for Final Fantasy XVI, then definitely subscribe as there's more on the way. If you're after a guide to Final Fantasy XVI's combat, then check out some of my previous videos. With all that said and done, let's dive right in. Before I give you my top tips for Ultramaniac mode, first we have to understand what exactly it is. Ultramaniac mode is a difficulty that is exclusive to New Game Plus, specifically when playing under Final Fantasy mode. To access Ultramaniac mode, you have to visit the Arete Stone in the Hideaway, where you'll be able to pick between going through a stage on Final Fantasy mode or Ultramaniac mode. Similar to Final Fantasy mode, Ultramaniac features remixed enemy encounters, enemies that do more damage, and enemy AI that is much more aggressive. And as an added addendum, if you die during an arcade mode stage on Ultramaniac mode, there are no continues, which means you'll have to start the entire stage from the very beginning. And thus we come to the first tip that I can share with you, and that is to play defensively. Throughout your first initial playthrough of Final Fantasy XVI, you'll likely be able to just blitz through the entirety of your enemies without a care in the world to what exactly they're doing. Perhaps you'll pull off some precision dodges here and there with good timing every once in a while, and sometimes you'll be able to remember to use your limit break to perhaps break out of a stun lock, or to just heal yourself up. That approach isn't something that you'll be able to do here, as even standard enemies can kill you in just a couple of hits, and mini-bosses and bosses can take you out in just one, which means only one single mistake, one single slip-up, is all that is needed to send you immediately to the game over screen. And so you really want to slow things down, play defensively, and make sure to take advantage of your enemy's recovery animations. Typically whenever mini-bosses, bosses, and some enemies throw out large attacks, they'll end up in a quite lengthy recovery animation which will allow Clive to get in and deal out some damage. And so it's important that you pick and choose your moments and know when to hold back and when to go in for the kill. And that quite conveniently brings us to my next tip, which is to ensure that you have an adequate loadout of skills for whatever encounter it is that you're going to face. Typically, you're going to want to bring your strongest, most damaging, most stagger building skills possible to give yourself a fighting chance against some dire situations. A personal favorite combination of mine is Ramuh's Lightning Rod and Bahamut's Giga Flare. Two useful skills in their own right, but when combined together, do an immense amount of physical and will damage. I also suggest equipping Shiva as one of your three icons, primarily for her Cold Snap ability, where through a precision dodge, you're able to freeze all of the enemies in any given area in the battlefield. This will allow you to stop whatever it is that a boss or enemy is doing, allowing you to line up a pretty big combo of moves. And of course, if you're finding any encounter too difficult to deal with, it's always worth looking at your skills to make sure you've got the best equipped for that particular situation. Moving on to our next tip, and I imagine this one will be pretty divisive, don't be afraid to use items if you absolutely have to. And when I say items, I don't necessarily just mean healing items like potions or high potions, but items that can buff your strength or defense, such as the stone skin or the strength tonics. On Final Fantasy mode, you're essentially able to buy whatever items you need and stock yourself up to help minimize the difficulty of a lot of the encounters out there. On Ultramaniac mode though, however, success largely comes down to player skill. The game makes it a point to start you off with only a very limited pool of items to ensure that you're not going to be able to cheese your way towards victory. And so if your goal is to simply just survive and prevail over the difficulty, by all means use the tools that the game gives you. You can attempt no damage and no item runs whenever you're more familiar with the game. Up next is another tip that pertains to both Ultramaniac and Final Fantasy mode, and that is to ensure that your gear and your accessories are as upgraded as possible. Arcade mode, and by extension Ultramaniac mode, will actually limit what weapons, braces, and belts you're able to take into a particular stage. However, you can use whatever icons and more specifically whatever accessories that you want. And so it's important that you take full advantage of one of the perks of New Game Plus, and that is the fact that you're able to reinforce your gear and your weapons to a point that is much further than you could have in the original playthrough. And of course, for Final Fantasy mode, where you're able to equip whatever defensive gear and weapons you want, it's also important that you keep those up to date as well. Due to the nature of Ultramaniac and arcade mode, where your levels and such are limited, these next couple of tips are exclusive to Final Fantasy mode. The first of which, of course, being making sure that you keep your levels in line with where the game expects you to be. If you're facing enemies in the main quest that end up being 5 to 6 levels higher than you, you're going to have a fairly difficult time. And so it's always worth ensuring that you're killing enough enemies and doing perhaps enough hunts or side quests to make sure that your levels are in line with where the main quest expects you to be. You can make up for this shortfall in levels between Clive and his enemies by simply just being a good player and making use of good player skills, but just be aware that Clive will take more damage and you'll do less damage towards enemies, which can make encounters longer than they have to be. That also conveniently ties into our next tip, and that is that I definitely suggest that you tackle a large portion of the hunts in Final Fantasy XVI, particularly because even in New Game Plus, the materials needed or required to craft or reinforce your way to the next strongest weapon that is available at any given point all reside in the notorious marks, essentially ensuring that if you want a permanent damage upgrade in the form of a new sword, you're going to have to go and hunt down a pretty difficult boss. The only caveat to this, of course, is Ultima Weapon, the ultimate sword that Clive can get in this game, which boasts 700 physical damage and 700 will damage. To get this sword, you have to follow a particular questline that is tied to the blacksmith in the hideaway. Moving on to my last tip, which is combat-based and applicable to both Ultramaniac and Final Fantasy mode, and that is to make full use of the space in any given combat encounter, both horizontally and vertically. You'll notice that if you're able to bring an enemy into the air by launching them and then comboing them to your heart's content, typically the enemies that are on the ground, provided they don't throw out projectile attacks, will literally not be able to attack you. And so launching enemies and defeating them mid-air is one of the easiest ways to divide and conquer any given combat encounter. Garuda's Deadly Embrace and the combination Stomp ability are your best friends in a situation like this, where using Deadly Embrace on even larger bosses and enemies will throw you way up into the air with repetitive use, throwing you well clear of a lot of their attacks, provided they're not projectiles of course, and it will also allow you to pull enemies up into the air quite easily to combo them to death. It's also worth mentioning that a lot of the ultimate skills that an icon has, such as Shiva's Diamond Dust or Bahamut's Giga Flare, typically tend to freeze the battlefield entirely throughout their entire duration. They also fall to the brim of Incibility frames, allowing you to quite easily just evade an attack without even moving, just by activating this skill with great timing. Similar to how you can use a limit break activation to iframe your way through any given attack. And with that, we come to the end of today's video. If you found it enjoyable or helpful, leave a like and subscribe, as there's more content on the way. And if you feel like I missed something, let me know down in the comments below. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.